Thanks, Kiara. It's delightful to be here and to be sharing our experience and learning from the other members in this network. This network's been really valuable to us. It's really informed sort of a lot of our thinking about sort of where we might go next. So I just want to give you a quick overview on the Green Ribbon Commission, where we came from, how we're structured, and a couple of the successes that we have had, and sort of where we're going forward. So if you could move it to the next slide. So our mission is to accelerate the implementation of the City of Boston's Climate Action Plan by convening, organizing, and enabling leadings from Boston's key sectors. Now, the term commission is a little misleading because this is a totally volunteer CEO network. It's not a unit of city government, and it's not established with any executive orders or anything like that. We currently have 36 members. They represent primarily the large property owner sectors in the city of Boston. We've done just sort of a back of the envelope analysis. The organizations that sit on the Green Ribbon Commission control about 10% of the total square footage in the city. We have a very close relationship with the city, and we think about the city as our customer for this work. Every mayor, since when we were established in 2010, has agreed to co-chair, be a co-chair of the commission. So that relationship is very important. And just quickly sort of where the GRC came from. We were established in 2010, and it really came out of two events that simultaneously happened in 2009. And one was the city of Boston developing its first really serious climate action plan. They had a citizen commission and a task force and a whole bunch of engagement processes around that. And then at the same time, our local largest independent foundation, the Barr Foundation, made a commitment to put $10 million a year for 5 years into climate action in a combination of Boston, Massachusetts, and New England. And the head of the Barr Foundation, Amos Hofstadter, and then Mayor Menino, were having a conversation about this sort of synchronicity of events. And the question was, where's the civic business leadership table to have the long-term climate conversations? Because if you look at the plan, it's clear that there are major changes that are transformational changes that will need to be made in the city's operating systems. And as the speakers have noted, most of those systems some of them are controlled by the city, but a lot of them are controlled by private and institutional players. So if we're not bringing that leadership along, there's no way we'll be able to make those changes. And it turned out that there just wasn't an organization in Boston that could serve that purpose back in 2010. So the mayor and Amos Hofstadter invited 34 people, 32 said yes, and we were off to the races. If you go to the next slide a little bit, in terms of our structure, as indicated, we have 36 CEO members. We have 4 sector working groups: higher education, healthcare, commercial real estate, and cultural institution. And the sector working groups give us an opportunity to engage a whole nother ring and network of players. So in most cases, we have 1 or 2 of the Green Ribbon Commission members who co-chair the working groups, and then the working groups will bring in the case of the cultural institutions, there are additional 38 cultural institutions who participate in that. So that enables us to really broaden our engagement. We have had periodic issue working groups, so we still have one on climate preparedness, we've had one on carbon neutrality, we've had one on transportation, and we're in the process of putting one together around climate justice. We have an executive committee of 8 to kind of lead the commission, and we have a development committee that works on our funding and fundraising. And just parenthetically, from a funding point of view, we have 26 of the 36 members that provide operating support, and that's where most of our operating support comes from. Our operating budget is somewhere in the order of about $1 million US a year, and then we're raising somewhere between $500,000 and $750,000 for specific projects. So the budget is somewhere between $1 to $2 million a year, depending on what kinds of projects we are working on. Next slide, please. So if you look back over the last 10 years, we've gone through a couple of cycles of engagement with this network. And we spent probably the first 3 to 4 years really making sure we had a really good shared understanding about climate and its impact and what needed to be done about it, its relationship to the economy, et cetera. Boston has great federal networks on climate action. We were able to bring in people like John Holdren, who was Obama's science advisor, and give us updates on science. So we spent a long time really getting this group educated about climate. When we invited them in, interestingly, we did not look for people who had a lot of experience with climate and climate action. What we looked for is leaders in their sector. So if they moved, the idea would be that other people would be moving with them. And then the next kind of phase that we moved into was really, and this is where the sector working groups are really important, sort of building sector leadership and a culture of best practice sharing. We refer to many of these organizations as first movers, and they're out front and they're ahead of the rest of the pack, so to speak. And we bring them together, help them share best practices with each other, and help advance their own practices. And then we're entering another interesting phase now, which is you got an informed network. They know what sort of the state of the art is, and what the art of the possible is. And we're now using that network to drive policy change, both at the city scale and at the state scale, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So I think this is sort of the evolution, and then as the policy mandates get put in place, we can use the sector leadership best practice sharing as a way of helping folks understand how to comply with the policy. So if you move to the next slide, just a couple of quick examples of specifically where the Green Ribbon Commission has helped and supported the city and helped accelerate the city's work, one around renewable energy, one around resilience, and one around building performance standards. Next slide. So we put together a renewable energy purchasing network, and this was primarily higher education and healthcare institutions who are watching all these people do these really large power purchase agreements in other parts of the country and sort of saying, well, how come we're not doing this here? So we put together a network. We brought in consultants to support them. We did best practice sharing between them. We established a renewable energy leadership prize that we got foundation funding to support. And all of this activity, after about, I think it was 2 years of work, resulted in the largest multi-party virtual PPA at that time in the country, total of 60 megawatts. This was in 2016, and now has led to a really large number of these institutions going on and doing their own power purchase agreements. So this sort of built a practice area around power purchasing that hadn't existed, built an understanding within the institutions of what it took to do it, and built some capacities for them to execute on it. Next slide. So the next big, lift for us was around resilience and resilience planning. This is a picture of Boston with what they refer to as our wicked high tides, which is our king tides. And it's not sunny, but it's sort of what they refer to as sunny day flooding. There's no storm event. This is just a high tide, and this is one of the downtown wharfs. So a lot of the city is built on what they call made land, basically was fill, and when it was done back in the 1700s and 1800s, it was done with 1 foot of freeboard, and we're experiencing as the oceans rise, we're experiencing that now. Next slide. So this kind of, I think, a useful little example about how the commission's network really helped accelerate the city's work. So we have 2 large commercial real estate players on the Green Ribbon Commission. One is Boston Properties, and they're, I believe, the top Class A property developer and manager in the U.S., and Beacon Capital Partners. And both of them have very large holdings down in New York City. So in 2012, they went through the whole Hurricane Sandy experience and came back sort of quite urgently freaked out. One of them brought back pictures of fish swimming across his first story windows. and basically said, look, if a storm like that hits us here in Boston, we'd really be in trouble, and we need to radically accelerate our work on resilience. And so we as the commission ended up partnering with the city. We raised $1 million of capital to do all the research and analysis, and we hired a consultant to do it, HR&A, who had done the resilience work down in New York City, and we put a project team together, and that resulted in the city's resilience strategy called Climate Ready Boston, which then spawned a whole nother second round of projects. We now have resilience plans for the 5 most at-risk neighborhoods in the city. We looked at whether or not we should have a harbor barrier or not. The answer was no, by the way. We're in the city's in the process of implementing a flood overlay district as part of its zoning ordinance, which would require all new developments to be resilient to 40 inches of sea level rise. And we're starting to explore options for long-term resilience governance and finance structures. If you look at those 5 plans, we need to spend somewhere in the order of $2 to $4 billion over the next 3 decades to protect the city from sea level rise. And we don't have the structures and financing vehicles in place to do that, which is going to be one of our next areas of focus. Next slide. And then finally on building emission performance standards, sort of similar to the way that we worked with the Climate Ready Boston. The city asked us to put a working group together on carbon neutrality, which we did. And we raised, in this case, I think it was $1.3 million to do an analysis of the deep decarbonization pathways for the city, put it out in a series of reports called Carbon Free Boston. The city then took that analysis. And by the way, that analysis was done by one of our partner entities, Boston University, that sits on the Green Ribbon Commission, their Institute for Sustainable Energy. And the city took that analysis and used that analysis to inform their 2019 Climate Action Plan update that includes the sort of the strategies around deep decarbonization for the next 5 years. And 3 of them are related to policy mandates. And the first is to develop a carbon emission performance standard to decarbonize existing large buildings. We're just totally delighted because 3 weeks ago, that ordinance passed the city council with a unanimous vote. And so we now have in place, similar to the New York Local Law 97, we have an ordinance that requires all buildings that are 20,000 square feet or higher to meet emissions performance 5-year standards that get them to net zero by 2050, which is really a great accomplishment. We're in the process, in the second bullet, of actually putting a zero net carbon requirement for new development as part of the city's development approval process. And we are working quite actively at the level of the Commonwealth, since the building code in Massachusetts is controlled at the state level, to in fact get a zero net carbon stretch code option at the state level. So a couple, again, 3 examples of where having this network in place, having these relationships with these players in the various sectors allowed us to organize resources and organize stakeholders in ways that really move the city's agenda along. Last slide, please. So a couple of just, I think reflections on what has made this process work for us. It took a patient early funder, quite frankly. If we hadn't had the Barr Foundation, who was really our core funder at the front end, who was willing to put risk capital in, there's no way this would have been able to get off the ground. Now we have a very stable and very broad base of funders, but it took 5-6 years to get to the point where we could raise the capital from other players. So having an early patient funder, stick with a C-suite participants, don't have it turn into a staff group. It's really critical that this be sort of either CEO or EVP level players in these organizations, because peers like to interact with peers, and those folks can activate a lot of change in the city. We talked about a strong city partnership. These partnerships don't work if the city's not at the table and willing to both engage and act on things. We have to engage our sector leaders really closely. and build relationships between them. There are an extraordinary number of the players on the Green Ribbon Commission that have been there for 10 years, and they have built relationships with each other that they didn't have before they got there, that now they find very useful for their overall kind of business strategy, which is the kind of last point is we work a lot to figure out how to connect climate action to the quote unquote day jobs of the CEOs. How, knowing about and acting on this, does this support your ongoing business strategy? So that's my last slide. Wanted to give you a quick overview. I want to say again how pleased we are with the relationship with C40 and their partners, because we're really interested in what other cities are doing this. Quick example, we have not historically focused a lot on making sure the members of the Green Ribbon Commission are in fact implementing climate action plans in their own organizations that are aligned with the city's targets. And we're starting to work on that. And a lot of this, the city business partnerships have started with that, which is organizations that have committed to certain kinds of standards and outcomes. So understanding how that's done is really useful to us, because I think that's going to be another phase of our work. So thank you, Kira, for the opportunity.